Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We're going to give people a couple minutes to get settled here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So we're getting settled in. As we go through our presentations, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Our plan today is to have each of the presenters go through their slides and then take questions at the end of each presentation. And then if we have any time remaining at the end of the webinar, we can take any additional questions at that time as well. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off here. So my name is Aaron Levine. I'm a senior legal and regulatory analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab. I've been here for about 11 years working on a number of issues related to renewable energy, including geothermal. Today, we're going to be talking about non-technical barriers to geothermal development in both California and Nevada. For starters, I wanted to give just a little background on a Department of Energy Geothermal Technologies Office lab call. This lab call was focused on funding opportunities for project proposals on state and local environmental management issues. These included permitting, and from this lab call, the Geothermal Technologies Office selected 3 projects to investigate state and local environmental management issues. These labs, the National Renewable Energy Lab, the Pacific Northwest National Lab, and Idaho National Lab, each completed reports in this area. The 3 labs worked together to conduct qualitative interviews with federal, state, local agencies and project developers, and shared information that we collected throughout the process to create consistency throughout our projects. And then from there, we really split off and have some distinct focuses of our research and analysis, and that's what we're going to walk through today. So beginning on the NREL side, we focused predominantly on non-technical barriers related to regulatory and permitting, as well as what those cost impacts might be. Some of our key findings included that numerous authorities play a role in approving geothermal project development, and as a result, streamlining and consolidating agency processes and increasing coordination and communication between federal, state, tribal, and or local authorities may decrease project development delays and lower costs. In addition, we found that there was a number of duplicative federal and state permitting requirements, which may increase timelines. These could be seen within both permitting and environmental review processes in California and Nevada. In some cases, in California, you may be required to complete both state and federal level environmental reviews, where in Nevada, we noticed that even when on federal land, there may be requirements to receive both drilling permits from the state as well as from the Bureau of Land Management at the federal level. And these duplicative or lengthy processes can add to the overall timelines. For context, here's a couple examples within California and Nevada, and you can just see the number of agencies involved. If you look at the first column, you can see that at the federal level, there's a number of agencies that may be involved through various federal statutes. And then highlight an example at the California state level, you can see that once you get into the state processes, state and local agencies may also play a number of roles. And so this really highlights the importance of coordination amongst all of these jurisdictional authorities at various levels. Some of our key takeaways within this space included that the numerous federal, state, tribal, and local agencies or authorities are involved in the process. And as a result, there's a need for coordination across these agencies, Various mechanisms that we identified that have been used include memorandums of understanding, including and kind of distinct with the new National Renewable Energy Coordination Office that was stood up under the Energy Act of 2020, informal working groups that might address specific resource areas or specific issues, as well as comprehensive siting processes. An example of this was the California Energy Commission's application for certification process, which really rolled all the state level approvals into a single process and issues a single certificate to allow development. We also identified a number of key environmental and resource issues in California and Nevada. Sensitive resources on project sites may require additional analysis and permitting. Both in California and Nevada, we saw site-specific challenges due to the presence of sensitive resources, which may include species or cultural resources, and these ultimately can lead to project delays and increased project costs and risks. Within California specifically, we were looking at Imperial County in the greater Salton Sea area. A number of the areas we identified included waters of the United States jurisdictional determinations within the Salton Sea area, which can add time and, previous to being able to apply for a 404 permit from the Corps and needing that 401 water quality certification, both under the Clean Water Act from the state, a jurisdictional determination is necessary at the outset. And we noticed that in multiple instances, this has led to a number of delays in the timeline. Water quality analysis more broadly in the Salton Sea due to the nature of the resource, and then biological species, particularly in the Sonny Bono National Wildlife Reserve. We also noticed, a number of potential cultural and tribal resource impacts, particularly through comments filed on previous environmental review documents. Ultimately, all of these issues play into the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act processing timelines, where all these issues need to be documented and in some cases mitigated or addressed. Similarly, in Nevada, we saw a number of environmental and cultural issues. One of the most noteworthy was we were looking in the Dixie Valley region at the Dixie Meadows project site. And throughout this process, we saw the development of the Dixie Valley toads listing. And so this began and ultimately at the conclusion of our report was still subject to a Fish and Wildlife Service emergency listing under the Endangered Species Act that has since led to a permanent listing for the Dixie Valley toad under the Act, which will now require Section 7 compliance under the Endangered Species Act. And this process has led to a number of timeline increases at the project site. We also identified a number of cultural and tribal resource impacts, including impacts at the Dixie Hot Springs, where historically tribes have used for various reasons. And again, all of these can play into the NEPA processing timelines as the Bureau of Land Management, in this case, works to complete EAs, which took a number of years to complete. Some of our key takeaways in this area included that comprehensive environmental review documents and associated landscape level surveys, such as looking at cultural or biological resources at a landscape level as opposed to an individual project site, can increase certainty around development potential and associated natural and cultural resource conflicts. Again, these could cover large geographic areas and then tier off of those for individual projects. You can potentially have coordination between NEPA and CEQA in California to better align federal and state resource concerns. And some of these concepts could be used either technology specific, such as updates to a geothermal programmatic environmental impact statement, or could cover multiple technologies within a geographic area. We also had a key takeaway of WOTUS determinations for the Salton Sea, comprehensive analysis of what are actually waters of the United States within the Salton Sea could increase certainty and reduce the time spent on individual WOTUS determinations occurring on a case-by-case basis. And currently the process requires this waters of the United States determination, again, prior to the state undertaking a 401 water quality certification under the Clean Water Act, and then the Army Corps of Engineers issuing that 404 permit under the Clean Water Act. And then finally, I wanted to highlight some of the economic impacts of geothermal development timelines. And so one area we focused on was trying to identify what these delays could result in terms of project costs and economic uncertainty. As part of this, we looked at using our GET'em tool to understand the techno-economics of geothermal projects, and particularly focused on the levelized cost of electricity. We looked at these in 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12-year time increments. Generally, we use an 8-year as the default timeline for developing a geothermal project. This helped us understand what that might look like if you potentially shave 4 years off of that process or add 4 years off that process under various project scenarios. You can see here we looked at this for both flash and binary technology for hydrothermal. Ultimately, we noticed that between the baseline that we use, the 8-year timeline, you were looking at between a 1 and 1.5 cent per kilowatt hour increase for that cost of electricity when you're extending the timeline to 12 years, and similarly, a half cent to up to a cent almost decrease if you moved that timeline up to 4 years. And so you can see this window here creates almost a 2 cents or more than 2 cents difference in the kilowatt cost of electricity. In another form, you can see here just in a plotted graph how this timeline increases the LCOE for both hydro and flash technology. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my discussion, and happy to take any questions we may have at this time. If we don't have any questions this time, we can move on to our next presentation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Aaron. Can you stop sharing so I can? Thank you. And can you confirm that that's sharing okay?
Yep, it looks good.
Great. So hey, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Dave Goodman. I'm a senior regulatory analyst at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I've been at the lab for about 4 years. To start, I just want to give thanks to my co-authors, Patrick Myrick and Kyle Wilson, who did a ton of work on this, particularly with the economic model that I'm going to be discussing here today. And also want to thank Aaron and team and Hari and team for a lot of collaboration and coordination as we went through our efforts, which were, I would say, very well aligned with slightly different focuses. And I think overall that was a good thing. So we have kind of different perspectives and flavors and focus areas, but I think there were a lot more a lot of consistencies throughout the research that we did. So first off, give just a high-level summary of our report that we completed and published last year. So Aaron talked somewhat about the Salton Sea in California, but had a focus in Nevada as well. We focused primarily on the Salton Sea, noting that the Salton Sea has substantial resources and opportunities for development of geothermal, but also recognizing that even at this location, with the resource potential that exists there, the price and cost of geothermal can be higher than other renewable resources such as solar and wind. One big thing that we found is that if you add in the potential for co-located lithium and other mineral resource extraction from geothermal brines, that can really help to even the playing field. So we looked at the history of geothermal development at the Salton Sea and did a comparison to other renewable energy sources in the area, which I'll hit in a subsequent slide. And then we developed a techno-economic model that we refer to as MAGE, the model for analysis of geothermal economics, to analyze the benefits and costs of various variables relevant to geothermal development. And then we provided recommendations for how we could go about streamlining geothermal development at the Salton Sea in particular, but with general principles that I think could be applied elsewhere. So this slide's intended to show information that we found as to the relative costs of geothermal as compared to solar, wind, and solar with battery backup. Power purchase agreements represent the actual prices agreed upon in a contract by an energy producer and a buyer. So that's a useful metric. So that's one metric that we looked at, and that's the metric that's in the table on the right. We also looked at the levelized cost of electricity, which is a more complex and holistic estimate that takes into account capital costs, risks and returns, capacity factor, efficiencies, fuel costs, and other factors. So as you can see on the table on the right, geothermal power purchase agreements have been substantially higher than these other renewables, including solar with a battery backup. You can see the mean power purchase agreements from southwestern states, 28 to 24, geothermal mean of 71, with the others substantially less than that. However, we did look into benefits that geothermal presents that may not be factored into these PPAs. First off, a high capacity factor is one substantial benefit, and the capacity factor represents the reliability of a project. Geothermal is a stable resource that can provide baseload power and is not dependent on weather or atmospheric conditions like wind and solar can be. We found that geothermal can generate about 2 to 4 times as much electricity as a wind or solar energy plant of the same installed capacity. I will note that battery backup is intended to increase the capacity factor of solar when used, and really may represent a more direct competitor to geothermal. I will also note that the footprint of geothermal plants is relatively small, particularly compared to the large footprint of solar, which can require 4 to 8 acres or more per megawatt. And overall, we found that once the factors in the LCOE, levelized cost of electricity, are considered, geothermal is much more competitive with other renewables than when simply reviewing power purchase agreements. And then in the remainder of our report, we looked at, that notwithstanding, we looked at opportunities to decrease the LCOE and make geothermal even more competitive with these other renewables. And that's what I'm going to talk about in these subsequent slides. So using the techno-economic model that we developed, MAGE, we ranked the relative sensitivity of various factors that can affect the geothermal LCOE. So at the top of the table, you can see the factors that had the least impact on the geothermal LCOE. And at the bottom, you can see the factors that had the greatest impact. I'll note that most of these are self-explanatory. One that probably isn't may be discount rates. The discount rate is the opportunity cost that an investor has when lending money. Higher discount rates are associated with projects with higher risks, which require higher returns to account for the risk. Lower discount rates represent projects with lower risks. So at the Salton Sea, we found that there were opportunities to reduce the discount rate based upon a well-characterized geothermal resource, relatively low likelihood of drilling failure, increasing certainty in construction costs, and an increasing chance for timely regulatory approval. We found that with all of those factors considered, that could have a substantial impact in lowering the discount rate and therefore reducing the geothermal LCOE. So the next couple slides show some of the other impacting variables on geothermal costs that we looked at. Certainly federal and state intervention, either through the use of tax incentives, subsidies, loan guarantees, or others, can have a huge impact in reducing geothermal development and operational costs. And this slide on the left shows some of the ongoing and potential federal and state processes that may have the potential to reduce the geothermal LCOE. Even in the past few weeks, there have been new executive orders like Executive Order 14096, which has the goal of advancing environmental justice, and many pieces associated with that. And we think there are opportunities there for incentives that may lead toward increased development of renewable resources like geothermal. I would say particularly in underserved and disadvantaged communities like those surrounding the Salton Sea. And on the right of the screen there, you can take a look at some of these subsidies that we took a look at, and we get into a little more detail as to how those may be applicable and how those might affect the LCOE in our report. So by far the most impacting variable on the LCOE that we analyzed was co-located lithium extraction. So theoretically, geothermal and lithium extraction can work symbiotically. Lithium can be extracted from geothermal brines, while geothermal can power the needs of the lithium plant. And we're interested in seeing it deployed at a large scale. The Hell's Kitchen project in Imperial County is moving along through the approval process, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm looking forward to seeing that operated and to see how the co-located lithium and geothermal works in that process. In California, the California Energy Commission has regulatory for permitting geothermal projects, and in some cases can delegate for smaller projects to the county level. But CalGEM has regulatory for permitting mineral development, including lithium. And I just want to note that in order for this process to work as best as possible, these entities will need to cooperate and work together to ensure effective, timely, and low-risk permitting. So finally, after using the MAGE model to analyze a number of different variables and focusing specifically on how this could streamline projects at the Salton Sea, we concluded our report with some general recommendations that certainly do apply at the Salton Sea, but we think are likely to be relevant regardless of the project location. And I know that this is in some ways consistent with some of the conclusions that Aaron and team reached as well. In general, we think these are just good, strong, best management practices that can help to streamline the geothermal development process. So with that, that's all I have here today. On the slide here, you can see a link to our PNNL report number. I think if you Google PNNL report 32717, that would be the first hit there, or you're welcome to get in touch with me by either email or phone. And I'm not sure if there are any questions, but that's all I have for now. So thank you. And hearing no comments, I will turn things over to Hari.
Hey, thank you. So let me share my screen. So can you hear me nicely?
We can hear you.
Okay, so my presentation is it coming nicely, or?
It's not in presentation mode yet.
So can you, yeah, so I'm gonna just do that.
That looks good.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, first, my name is Hari. So I work here at Idaho National Lab. By training, I'm a geochemist, geologist, and for the last close to 10 years, I have been working at INL, mostly working on geothermal exploration, EGS, critical mineral evaluation in geothermal brines, water rock interaction, thermal energy storage type projects. And this is a new project for me. And along with Aaron and Dave, we started this project like a few years ago, and we completed this project I think in spring of 2021 or so. And in my presentation, mostly I'm just going to include economic impact of permitting timelines and produce geothermal power in Imperial County. So again, going back to the Salton Sea area. Besides Imperial County, we also did some work on Nevada, a couple of sites in Nevada, and a couple of power plants in Utah. So I'm just going to show a few numbers from those two states, Nevada and Utah, and mostly include most of my work going to be like from Imperial County. In the past, mostly Aaron and his group has done a lot of work on these non-technical issues related to geothermal energies, and they have identified several barriers to expand market share of geothermal power. And in this presentation, so I'm just including permit issues. It includes land access, permitting to get access to the exploration, drilling, exploration boreholes, production boreholes, those development activities, and timelines to get approval, timeline for the environmental reviews for those applications are all included into this non-technical barrier permit issues. And in this study, we conducted quantitative analysis of those non-technical barriers impact on the cost of produced electricity. So my presentation is mostly related to this techno-economic analysis and impact of timelines. Again, so I'm just going back to this map, Imperial County, which is located on the Southern California. Over the years, mostly in the late 1970s and early 80s, USGS has defined several KGRAs. KGRAs means non-geothermal resource areas in this county. There are 9 KGRAs here. And out of those 9, 4, including Heber, East Mesa, Brawley, and Salton Sea, these are the KGRAs that host geothermal power plants. And most of the geothermal power plants in this county are located in the Salton Sea geothermal areas. So currently this area has like 11 power plants in operation. One is being planned. So that's the CTR that Dave was mentioned, Controlled Thermal Resources Geothermal project that they are currently working on to produce power as well as to extract lithium from the brine. And this, besides these non-geothermal KGRs, there is one small geothermal area, resource area, Struckhaven, on the western side of this Salton Sea. And as of now, Programmatic is working on to evaluate resource available in that area. And this bar diagram shows when we have the most of the geothermal activities and the power, geothermal power plants being built. So you can see here, most of the power plants in this county were built or constructed in the 1980s and 1990s. And after that, we have very few number of development activities in that area, despite having a lot of resource potential. And for our study, we were more interested to find the timelines and costs associated with different permitting issues. That permitting starts from getting access to the land to construction of the power plant and transmission lines. And throughout that process, developers, they have to go through a multi-layered permitting process. They have to apply for access to the land. They have to apply to get permit to drill some temperature gradient boreholes, so forth. Some of these activities can go in parallel, concurrently, and sometimes it's a serial process. They complete one process and they move to the other. At the end, this process takes time, and cost adds up over time. And to complete whole this process, like, may take several years to several decades, so depending on the environmental or cultural issues at the project site. And as Aaron mentioned earlier, so we conducted a lot of interviews with the stakeholders. Actually, we teamed up. So INL, PNNL, and the other group, we coordinated, we invited stakeholders like developers and regulatory agencies. And we just did a lot of interviews. And throughout that process and data collection process, like, we identified some of the general issues like reconciliation on mitigation methods, when there is some environmental issues and that area has different jurisdiction for the approval, and they may come up with different mitigation methods, and there is some reconciliation has to be done on the methods that suggested by different regulatory agencies. It can take time. And some of the regulatory agencies, they lack subject matter experts, and it is also a reason to cause longer permitting timelines, and that lack of subject matter experts are mostly due to loss of people loss of people like to retirement. As you saw in the previous slide, like most of the geothermal activities were conducted in 80s and 90s, and those old folks, they retired, and these regulatory agencies lack subject matter experts. And another issues, at least like in a couple of resource areas in Imperial County, are fragmented nature of land ownership. This is very acute in the Rock Haven areas. And still the market forces are the biggest hurdle. So not favorable LCOEs compared to solar and wind are biggest hurdle to expand the geothermal energy. And some of the opportunities like streamlining this process when local, state, or federal agencies are involved, and they have different the processing times, and they have different regulatory framework, and they come up with different ideas. And even like sometimes like the stakeholder, mostly the developers, they want to see some improved interagency relationships to expedite this process and shorten the overall permitting timelines. That can help a lot to these geothermal developers in that area. And for the techno-economic analysis, we developed an Excel workbook. So first we collected data from existing power plants. That took a lot of effort from just getting all data was quite difficult. And we are able to at least like collect some data that we can use to actually conduct this TEA for a couple of sites. Second step was to make some necessary assumptions. For example, the lifetime of the power plant was assumed to be 30 years, and we adjusted all the cost associated with application to construction of the power plant and transmission of those things to the dollar amount of the project completion year. We assume like interest rate on all spent costs around 6%. And the capacity factor, we use 70%. This is on the lower side. I saw Dave used 9%. And the 70% is mostly influenced by the older geothermal technologies. But at least like in our case, like we use 70%. So, and third step, we just the calculations, we use the simplified LCOE to calculate these numbers. So if you need more detail on how to calculate or what this means, I refer you to the Law in 2020 paper. And some of the earlier calculations were done at the NREL. They also use this simplified LCOE. And to compare the LCOE for one plant to the other or one scenario to the other, it's like we feel like this is a good parameter. Then the last one, we did calculation with the potentially gained or missed revenue. This gained or missed revenue represent the aggregated revenues being generated or not generated from the produced or not produced electricity. We wanted to see, we wanted to compare. So from one scenario to the other. For this, we needed to create a hypothetical plant geothermal project in Salton Sea that was being subject to different environmental review and permitting scenarios. And we just compare the result from different scenarios. And as I mentioned earlier, so we did some work on the Utah and Nevada and on the Imperial County for this Horson Ranch 1. This one is the actually built geothermal power plant in the Salton Sea KGRA. And we did the calculation with 99.2, that's the LCOE per megawatt hour. And there was one Hudson Ranch 2. So they completed all the permitting process. They drilled a couple of geothermal wells, and they determined the resource was not there. And for that project, we used the cost of the plant similar to Hudson Ranch 1 and did the calculation. So this one is slightly higher in LCOE than the Hudson Ranch 1. We did similar calculation for Copeford in Utah and Salt Wells in El. So you can see here the LCOE values for Nevada and Utah are quite less compared to these Imperial County projects. This one was mostly due to the higher cost associated with the construction of power plant in Salton Sea area because of the hypersaline nature of the geothermal brine. So the brine is very corrosive and costly to build, and that has a significant impact on the LCOE value for these two projects. And so to compare the two tests, the sensitivity permitting timelines on the LCOE, we created a hypothetical project. And we subject that project into 5 different environmental management review scenarios. So these are mostly, these scenarios are very similar to the scenarios that GeoVision, mostly the Aaron and his group put together for the GeoVision studies. The scenario A, in this case, the area has a land use plan. Also, the area has programmatic environmental impact statement, PEIS or PEIR, so if that is for the CEQA, and if that area has no environmental or cultural issues, so that project could go through the scenario A permitting timelines. And so from scenario A to E, the scenario is more complicated, taking more time, and we calculated the timelines to complete the project for scenario A, B, C, D, and E. So just assuming the same hypothetical project was being subjected to these different scenarios. And for the general data, we use CTR, that control thermal resources project, ongoing project, and this hypothetical project has similar development stages as of that CTR's project. So they leased 1,000 acre of land from IID, that Imperial Irrigation District, for 30 years with different lease, rent rate, all those things. And they applied for the CUP, that's the conditional use permit, to the county, and it got approved with different scenarios. And they evaluate the resource, and it was deemed viable. Then they had this utilized and conditional use permit, and they got the approval in each different review scenarios. And the project was for 50 megawatt power plant with a cost similar to the Hudson Ranch. So this data provided us all the background data we needed for us to conduct the TEA. And I'm just gonna go very briefly here. So with scenario A, they could start and complete the project in 6 years. And with the scenario B, they could finish the project in 8 years, and scenario C, 9 years, and for the scenario D, 13 years. We did not do the scenario E. And this one gives the cost associated with different activities here. So the important ones are this LCOE. With scenario A, LCOE is $103 per megawatt hour. With the scenario D, that takes like 13 years to complete, the LCOE is $114. And assuming the scenario A as an ideal, scenario B, C, and D would miss a significant amount of revenue over the years. So from like more than 60 million to more than $200 million if that project was subject to scenario D permitting timelines. So in conclusion, development of geothermal resource requires multi-layer regulatory permitting by local, state, and federal agencies. We collected permitting and development related data for several sites, but we created a hypothetical geothermal power plant development in Salton Sea KGRA that was subject to for review and permitting scenarios. The fastest timeline would have the project completed in 6 years. In contrast, the longest permitting timelines would need like 13 years to complete that project. And the longer timelines, the LCOE values with longer timelines were almost like 4 to 11% higher than the shortest one. And the potential loss of revenue from delayed completion of project would range from 64 to like over $200 million loss in revenue. Inefficient and protracted permitting processes can, in some cases, determine the success of geothermal projects. So the timelines can have like some quite significant impact, if not in the LCOE, but in the lost revenue, and can create a problem for the getting a lender or the project being successful. And I'd like to thank like DOE, GTO for supporting this, and Aaron and Dev also helped during that interview process, and we had a lot of discussion, meeting, all those things that actually helped me to work on this project. So that's all. Any questions?
Well, if we don't have any questions, we can go ahead and wrap up for the day. We will be posting this video recording for others to view at a later date. And we'll be sharing that information out once that's available. Other than that, thank you to both our presenters from PNNL and INL, as well as those who attended today, and the Geothermal Technologies Office for funding support. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you all. Have a good day.
Okay, thank you.